Yes, well, I mean, he launches his entree really on the London scene at a show at the Grosvenor Gallery, which was the pace setter for showing the kind of new artists. And there's sketches, I can't remember the sketches by, of Wilde wearing his cello coat. So you can see where he was coming from.
Didn't Constance see where he was coming from?
Well, absolutely, and I think this was part of the appeal. I mean, Constance, I think, was a sort of bit of a black sheep of her family. I think she also rather liked the fact that her family disapproved of him in the way a lot of young people do, you know.
Let's just touch briefly on his poetry. I know the literary world has not agreed on whether he was a good poet or not, but his first book of poems, which was published in 1881, was summed up in the Saturday Review. Mr. Wilde's verses belong to a class which is the special terror of reviewers, the poetry which is neither good nor bad, which calls for neither praise nor ridicule.
It's very rococo, and it's very kind of... I think another reviewer said of that first book, entitled Poems, and kind of printed in an edition of 150 on vellum or something like that, and kind of bound in lavender, that it was pointless to criticise it, Mr. Wilde's poems, because most of them belonged to somebody else, and then quotes a long line. And it became a scandal in its own right, this volume, when the Oxford Union, having requested it for their library, then rejected it, and it became, like many things in Wilde's life, a kind of cause célèbre. So it's not the poetry that draws me to Wilde. Where he finds himself is in prose,
yes.
but I think as an essayist is where I find him most powerful.
Yes.
When he wrote that volume, he was living with a young painter called Frank Miles. They shared a house together in Chelsea, and Frank Miles's father, who's a vicar, was so appalled by the sort of suggestive undertones of the poetry that Oscar was sort of asked to, to
I know,
leave.
it's a shocking irony, considering that, in fact, his boy Frank was up to far worse things at the time than Oscar actually was.
Absolutely, but I think what it does show is this desire really early on, and although he hadn't found his mark, he hadn't quite found his métier, there's this desire early on to just test the boundaries of society, just see how far you can kind of go and get away with.
Well, he did, and he did quite early on. He turned himself into, as you say, a cause célèbre. In 1882, he was invited on a lecture tour of America by Richard D'Oyley Carte, selling this charming aesthete to American audiences. He gave 140 lectures over 260 days, and here's his grandson, Merlin Holland, talking about it.
He had never given a lecture before he went to America. Indeed, he got some training, some speech training, from an actor in London at the time called Herman Vezin. And all he had in his suitcase, so to speak, when he arrived in America was a sort of general amalgam of Whistler, Rossetti, Ruskin, Pater. Some of them even quoted verbatim in the first month or so of his lecturing there. And I think he thought he was going over to tell the Americans really quite seriously, very un-Oscar in a sense as we think of him now, about what he termed the English Renaissance in art. And the lecture, when you read the reconstructions of it, is pretty heavy going.
What do you think American audiences in the Midwest made of him, Will?
I think they found him enormously fascinating
and
charming. And one of the things you've got to remember about Wilde, if we can get through everything else, is that he was an enormously charismatic and charming man. And many people commented on his great kindness. It was a very outre to come on, particularly in the States, which was a young and defiantly macho country, though of course it had its own apostles of gay aestheticism as well. To come on with this shtick, in essence, required enormous front, and I think the Americans kind of rose to that. They liked the chutzpah of it.
You're listening to The Great Life of Oscar Wilde, proposed by Will Self. Also here is Franny Moyle, biographer of Wilde's wife. In 1887, Wilde became editor of Ladies' World magazine, soon renamed The Woman's World. But he left, bored, in 1889, and the following year published The Portrait of Dorian Gray. Will, you have written a book called Dorian, bringing Dorian Gray up to date, is that right?
The thing that fascinated me immediately about Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray was that this is a book that's all about time. There are various fascinating things about it. One is it's one of the only real modern myths that we have. You know, we could go out from Broadcasting House here into the street and pick somebody at random, and they would know about The Picture of Dorian Gray. They probably wouldn't have read it. But in this book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is all about the ravaging effects of time, the decadent Dorian Gray remains pristine and young while the picture in the attic ages horribly. There is no external referent to time in it. There are no newspapers, there's no political events in the book. It is an enclosed, tightly enclosed and claustrophobic world. Indeed, you have to read the book quite closely to determine how many years have passed between when the portrait was painted and when it's exposed at the end. And I analysed the book and discovered this was 17 years. I automatically thought, well, what period of contemporary history do we have? And actually, completely coincidentally, or perhaps not, the period between the first cases of what came to be called AIDS on the west coast of America and the introduction of antiretroviral treatments was exactly 17 years. So I thought, well, that's it. I'm going to take The Picture of Dorian Gray and I'm going to update it to the modern era. But of course, the book itself is about disease, physical disease as well. There's strong evidence, and certainly his main biographer, Ellman, believes that Wilde himself had contracted syphilis. So, you know, The Picture of Dorian Gray itself can be seen, the original, as an extended metaphor for disease.
You've said that in order to write the book, you tried to make yourself gay as possible.
Not hard to do.
Isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting, all of this stuff. When I was writing Dorian, and I hugely enjoyed it. I started off writing it as a film script, but I came to certain stage directions, and I thought this movie's never going to be made, not in the form that I envisaged it. So I turned it back into prose narrative fiction. And when I was writing Dorian, I had erotic dreams about men. I was strongly attracted to men. But me being me, I started thinking, well, everybody's gay, which is perhaps not true. It wasn't until the book came out, and a friend of mine came back that summer and said, it's the hit, darling, on the beaches of Mykonos. Everybody's reading it. But actually sales were rather disappointing. And that's when I realised that perhaps everybody wasn't gay.
W.H. Smith perhaps felt that everybody wasn't gay.
Smith wouldn't take it, actually. Wouldn't take my Dorian.
Talking of which, Franny, let's talk about his lovers. You've suggested in your book that from 1887 to 1889 his conquests at least included artist Graham Robertson, Clark Fred Alphus, American playwright Clyde Fitch, writer John Gray. But the two that really mattered were Robbie Ross and Bosie, and it's about these two men that I'd like to ask you.
Robbie was someone who's introduced to Oscar and Constance's world relatively early on. I mean, I suppose they'd been married, 2 to 3 years, and Robbie was their young lodger. 17, 18, he was at a sort of local crammer in Covent Garden trying to get into Oxford, but already a very sort of precocious, sexually precocious young man. And, you know, Oscar does say that it was Robbie that seduced him. And then, of course, Bosie was some years later.
Bosie, I mean, if you could go back in time and painlessly cull somebody with a high-velocity rifle bullet, it would be Lord Alfred Douglas. Or, I mean, you might stop off in Vienna to bag Hitler, but I think you'd also go on and try and get Bosie.
What's quite interesting about Oscar's life, I think, is his ability to be manipulated. For such a huge character who, as we said, is very ballsy, he can dress up in funny clothes, he has no fear of audiences, he will entertain a room, but his mother tells him to do something and he will do it. And Bosie brought out this strange element in his character that actually was a profound weakness to certain influences, and Bosie could do anything. He was like a puppet under Bosie's influence. And
unfortunately, Bosie was the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, which takes us on to Wilde's downfall. The Marquis of Queensberry conceived a great dislike for Wilde, believing that he was corrupting his son.
The Marquis of Queensberry, nobody really has a good word for him. He's not a particularly savoury character. A bit bonkers, seems to have abused his wife as well. Had this kind of global anxiety about a kind of tribe of Sodomites kind of creeping
corrupting
around.
his sons.
But the reality, of course, was that his sons almost certainly were just gay anyway.
Yeah.
You know,
he was, however, right in his accusation.
Totally
his
right.
son was having an affair with Wilde.